No, I'm done. Yeah. Um, sorry for the pause. Yeah. Um, I start again. Dr. Balaji Venkatachary, Associate Professor, Mysore School of Architecture, is an architect and conservator. He has contributed as a consultant to various projects in the interest of architectural heritage, such as Heritage Impact Assessment for Hyderabad Golf Course at Golconda, listing and documentation of historic buildings in Chennai, energy audit studies for traditional Bengal industry in Firozabad to mitigate its detrimental effect on Taj Mahal, to mention a few. His prior assignments include his involvement in design projects such as resorts, retail, and office spaces in New Delhi and Bahrain. Prior to joining Mysore School of Architecture, he has taught in architecture schools in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. His research interests revolve around cultural landscapes, conservation, and architectural theory. Balaji graduated in 2007 from the Anna University, Tamil Nadu, and has an MArch in architectural conservation from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. He has earned his PhD in conservation from the School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for a generous introduction. And I hope I'm audible to you. There is some disturbance in some of our participants' mics are unmuted. I kindly
Participants,
request,
yeah, we
yeah.
please request you to mute your mics. We'll check it from the host end also, sir.
Um, I can hear loud noise from some of the participants' mics still. I think Architect Koteshwar, his mic is unmuted. Yeah.
I think now it's clear.
All participants are on mute, sir. Sir, I think you have to unmute. Balaji, sir, you have to unmute.
Very sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no problem.
I guess the presentation is visible now.
Yes, sir.
The presentation is visible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to stop my video since it is helpful for the online,
Yes,
save
we
time.
all have to.
Yeah, okay. Without much ado, I'll just get into the presentation. So the title today is Basics of Qualitative Coding for Architecture Research. So I'm going to talk about qualitative data analysis in specific. Just a moment. I'm not able to change the slide. All right. So the outline is going to be something like this. first let us quickly look at the difference between qualitative and quantitative research so that we place ourselves into the qualitative study. Then I'm going to introduce you straight away to the concept of qualitative coding. Then we look at certain coding strategies, then how to present those findings. In a nutshell summary, then I'll tell you the coding process. Then I quickly introduce you to some software and learning resources which might help you take this further. So the moment I say coding, it should not be confused with the computer programming or that sort of coding. It's not that kind of coding. Coding is a term used to assign labels to qualitative data. It can be done, traditionally it is done manually, but nowadays there are softwares available for it. But we'll just look at the concept of coding. All right, to know that, let's just quickly take a look at what is qualitative and quantitative data. As you all know, of course, quantitative data is a lot to do with the numbers, very precise numerical data. Qualitative data, on the contrary, is a non-numerical kind, which indicates various characteristics, like it could be names, colors, it could be certain other qualities of a particular data set. So qualitative data is to do with that. The moment we say quantitative data, pretty much this picture comes to our mind. So we have various ways of analyzing quantitative data. We calculate averages, mean, median, highest, lowest. We generate pie chart, bar charts. We find out patterns using regression. So this is quite a bit clearer. But then most of the time we see when we say qualitative data, there is a confusion always. Is there a method to look at qualitative data? What do we mean when we say qualitative data? We mean interview data. A lot of stories that are shared by the participants. You may have photographs and archival data, inscriptions, manuscripts. So these are all, these fall under qualitative data. Then how do we look at it? Is there a clear way of looking at qualitative data? Is sometimes younger researchers who are into the field, they're usually confused. So let's look at quickly some qualitative data collection method. How do we collect the qualitative data? Quantitative data, all of us know, we can clearly ask, example, age of the participant. In 50 households, we collect it, and then we can compile and find out the average age, income group, etc. But qualitative data, we collect it through one-on-one interviews, usually a longer conversation, at least for 20 minutes, 20 to 40 minutes conversation. So you'll have pages of writing, audio recording of the interviews. Sometimes we do focus group discussions. Focus group simply means gathering a lot of people who are related to the theme of our investigation and then talking to the entire group. And then from this, as a result, we have interviews which are written down, focus groups recordings, audio recordings, sometimes video recordings, record keeping. It's like bookkeeping, accounts, register, etc. So there could be record keeping. Observation data. We go around the site as architects and planners, and then there are a lot of observational notes written down onto your journal. Sometimes photographs of observation. Longitudinal studies are conducted over a longer period of time. Sometimes I go and investigate a particular case study this year and then go next year and do the same exercise so that the changes can be tracked. So I do that for 5 years consequently. Then I have a longitudinal qualitative data. So there are case studies which architects and planners are certainly familiar with. So these are all the ways we collect qualitative data. Then the confusion is, what do we do with all this data? Sometimes end of a study, even if it is for a week or long, you will end up with numerous amounts of written pages, maps which are drawn and overlaid, photographs, videos, audio recordings. Sometimes we don't know what to do with it, how to process this. This is a problem which I want to address today. There are several methods to analyze qualitative data. However, qualitative coding is one such which is very often used. So I want to talk about that. Not that this is not a known thing to everybody. Almost all of us have been applying coding methods in one or the other way in our studies. But sometimes consciously we don't recognize this is the systematic, this is the way to do it systematically. or sometimes we don't even know there is a technical background to this analysis technique. We simply do it, but we don't realize. So I just want to formally address the topic today. So what do you do with the qualitative data once you collect it from the field? First step is to becoming familiar with your data, which means you go through all the notes, you go through all the field recordings, etc. And then you sort of get a sense of the data. This generally doesn't happen in quantitative data analysis. We get on to the mathematical statistical methods, but in qualitative data, since they are wide range and diverse, we spend some time with the data in your desktop, and then you get familiarized with the data. The second step is the coding process, which I will in a moment elaborate to you throughout the presentation. We code the data. Third step, the codes which are developed help us to search for patterns and connections in the data. The last step is the interpretation of data. What happens for a beginner researcher? Generally, what we do, we collect data from the site and jump straight away to the last step, interpretation of the data, in which there will be a lot of bias. There will be no systematic method employed. Hence, our interpretations may not be complete, may not be fully satisfactory for the data collected. So sometimes we miss in the in-between process. In this particular presentation, I'll focus on the in-between step 2 and 3, coding into themes and searching for patterns. This is what I want to focus on, specifically the step 2, coding into themes. So what data can be coded? Now, we are talking about qualitative data. Hence, we are talking about narratives, the things, the kind of narratives people have given you from the field. Suppose you're researching on, let's say, a particular lake and lake bank settlement. Then you talk about people, what is the history of this place? And they give you several narratives. Someone talks to you from the migrant perspective, a migrant narrative. Someone's talked to you from an indigenous perspective, an indigenous narrative. So you have various perspectives and various narratives collected. So this is again a textual data, that how to look at this. So this data can be coded. Interviews, we have one-on-one interviews specifically with a government official or a resident or somebody else. We have detailed interviews. This can be coded. Stories told by people can be coded. Sometimes children don't have a way of expression like adults do. So with children on the field, we do various exercises to get information from children, not just interviewing. Interviewing doesn't work with children. So we can gather stories. Letter communication, suppose one is working on historic research, let's say colonial period, and then we have a lot of letter communication that can be coded. Visual material like paintings, photographs, maps, that can be coded. It is very useful for architects specifically, arts research and architecture research. Archival data, for example, inscriptions, manuscripts that are collected from the archival repository, that can also be coded to extract meaningful information from qualitative data. So this should be understood. However, the last two I'm not going to focus in this particular presentation, although you can use the same methods to code paintings, photographs, etc. We are going to look at largely the coding of the textual data, or let's say verbal or communicative data. Okay, so the most of the content which I have taken for this particular presentation is from this particular research called the Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers by Johnny Saldana. So this particular coding manual has been instrumental for a lot of qualitative coding exercises in the past decades. So this manual I thought is the best resource for us to begin with. So what is coding? What do you do? There are 4 major steps. If you start from the larger, these points which is shown in the diagram, okay, qualitative analysis is nothing but reducing data without losing meaning. I think that is the essence of qualitative data analysis. We have pages and pages of interviews, numbers of photographs, videos, but how do you reduce the data without losing the meaning, taking the essence of the data and developing interpretations? That is nothing but qualitative analysis. So let's start from codes. Codes are nothing but labels assigned to your data. So the data is numerous. You assign codes and reduce the data. Then the second step is to develop category. Third step is to develop theme, and lastly, through which you achieve a theory. You make theories. This is the process. Not to worry, I'm going to go one by one now in further slides so that one can understand. This might be confusing, but just to summarize, I say coding is the starting step, and then later it has to be developed into categories, themes, and finally it leads to our theories. How to do it? Let's see. Before that, some terminology I want you to remember. Code, category, theme, of course, from the previous slide. Memo used in qualitative data analysis. Very often keep referring to them. So what are these? I'll just give a brief description of that and then I'll proceed. Code is a label assigned to your data. Suppose there is a paragraph of something someone said in the interview. I make sense of the paragraph and assign a label to that paragraph, summarize it in 1 or 2 words or a phrase. That is called code. Category is groups of codes. Theme is larger themes which are pertaining to our research. Okay, this we'll discuss in detail later. But 2 more words I want all of you to remember is memo and quotation, which we use very commonly. Memo is nothing but the notes you take up during your field visit. Suppose.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt, but your screen is not visible. We can see a blank screen.
What's happening? It's a blank screen.
Yeah, to me it is a blank. Yeah, now it is seen.
Now it is visible.
No, your screen is visible, sir. It is visible. Yeah.
Since when it was blank?
No.
Were you
It
able
was
to?
visible all the time. I think Aarti had an issue.
Hello?
Okay, I'm sorry then. I think maybe, yeah, sure, sorry.
Yeah.
It's visible, right? Now it's visible.
Yes, the screen is visible. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Code, category, theme we have spoken about. 2 more words you please remember, because these are the 5 words which keeps coming across in qualitative research. If you have a team of researchers, we often keep talking to them in this language. Please share your memo. Please share the quotation from zone 5. Please share, let's aggregate the codes from zone 3. This is the language we speak. So what is a memo? Memo is your field notes that you will write during the field visit. When you're doing the field visit, you're collecting interview data. That is one thing. You're writing it down, you're photographing and things. But parallelly, we are also writing down some notes as interpretation. When you are on the field, you don't have to come back to the desktop. But meanwhile, itself, by looking at certain things, you get some analytical thoughts in your mind. Oh, this is probably the hypothesis. So you write down those notes, your own interpretations, your own analysis. So those notes written in the field is called a memo. Okay. And quotation is not from you, but from the respondents. Suppose certain things which are said by the respondent as a whole sentence is important for you. That is marked as a quotation. Why is quotation important? Hello? Yeah. Why is quotation important? Because while writing a qualitative research paper, while writing a quantitative research paper, it's quite easy because you describe the data and you have mathematical statistical methods applied and you start describing each of those analysis, and then you finally produce a finding. Okay. But while writing a qualitative paper, it's not as straightforward as that. We have to keep referring quotations from the field in the paper to validate your findings. So we often use these, what the respondent exactly said, certain sentences which are very important. So we collect it separately and then we use it in the paper, qualitative paper. So you please remember these 5 terms. Now I'll get into hardcore coding strategy itself. So I told you coding is nothing but assigning labels, to the data so that we can reduce the qualitative data to meaningful words or meaningful phrases. Okay. So what is the coding process, a coding strategy? First, we code things, the entire qualitative data. Second step is to sort it out. In a group of codes, sometimes what happens, we get repeated codes. One category of codes are, suppose I assign, okay. Suppose I was interviewing and then I got a category saying that this is an hybrid architecture. So I used a label called hybrid. Wherever, whatever the interviewer said related to hybrid, I'm using. So I'll gather, certain number of codes so I can sort them out. So I'll say end of the coding process, I'll say, okay, I got 4 categories of codes. One is hybrid, second one is something else, third one is something else. So that's called sorting. Then we start making sense of those codes, synthesizing. Then finally we arrive at the theory which we want to put across. So this is in a nutshell the coding strategy. Now I'll get into the coding cycles. Okay, what we do, don't look at all these words at once, you'll get confused. Just look at the top line, first cycle coding, after first cycle coding, second cycle coding. Then the bottom line, there is an arrow mark, and then it says towards abstract or general. So what we do, our data is not general, it's very specific, it's very, very broad. So we apply a first cycle coding, then we process it, then we apply a second cycle coding. That leads us to generalization of the data. It is not going to be any more specific. It's going to be patterns. It's going to be themes. It's going to be theories. To convert that, we have to apply the code. Okay. As I told you, code is a label. Now let's see what kinds of labels we can give to qualitative data. Like let's stick on to interview data only for now, for simplicity sake. Okay. You have gotten paragraphs and paragraphs of interviews written down. You are picking up 2-3 lines and assigning one word for that. Next 2-3 lines and assigning another word for that. That is the simple coding process. In the first cycle of coding, what do we do? There are certain types of coding: attribute coding, descriptive coding, emotional coding, evaluation coding, in vivo coding, magnitude coding, narrative coding, process coding, value coding, theming data. This is just pulled out from the Saldana's book. In fact, Johnny Saldana's coding manual has got even more varieties of coding mentioned. These are the commonly used ones. That's why we have pulled out these ones. In the next slide, I'll explain each one of that. What does each one of that mean? Okay, before you go to the second cycle of coding, what you do is you try to understand the relationship between the codes. Examples I will show so that it will clarify. Later in the slide, I will show the example. For now, just remember, there's a first cycle coding. There is a process in between the second cycle and first cycle coding, and there is a second cycle coding, where it's not going to be simple description. It's not going to be labeling of emotion, etc. It will be identification of patterns, identification of theory. So second cycle of coding is little more broader and generic, abstract. First cycle of coding is little more straightforward. That much you can remember. So what is in the quick example, I'll sort of tell you in the first cycle coding, all those different kinds of coding, what do they mean? Attribute coding, for example, participants' age, gender, education level. So in the paragraph of interview, somewhere these things occur. So you sort of label them with the attribute coding. Sometimes what happens, participant is speaking something and then we are writing down, but then they are also emoting parallelly, they are expressing their emotions. They are pessimistic about the whole situation, let's say. They're anxious about the whole situation. That cannot be captured in just writing down. So we code it in certain paragraphs. Let's say when you're interviewing, when the participant said something, and meanwhile the participant is crying, okay, expressing the emotion. We don't usually write down that as part of the interview, but we assign a code, a label called pessimistic or denial or expressing negative emotions, crying, etc. Sometimes we directly assign these emotional codes. So that helps us from after we are back from the field, we can see how many places these emotions have occurred. So that helps us sort it out. Suppose you interviewed 50 candidates about a particular situation, let's say sanitation of a particular locality. Okay, if they are very pessimistic about the government, suppose you have written out of 50 interviews, in let's say around 20 interviews, you have coded it as pessimistic. Then you get a sort of sense, whether the candidates of that area, they are pessimistic about the situation or positive about the situation. So this sort of expresses. In vivo coding is a very important coding, especially for the ethnographers. Ethnography is a technique where you root your research in the site itself, in the participant. In vivo coding means nothing but using the participant's own words to code your data. See, so for example, here you see never again, payback time, no negotiation. So suppose the participant said so many things, out of which this one word expresses the essence of the entire paragraph. You pick from the participant's own words and code it. That's called in vivo coding. Value coding, etc. I'm not getting into the detail of each one of them, but then for you to get an idea, how do we code the data? Magnitude coding, for example, intense, frequent, direction. These are all magnitude words. These words we use to code, something which is very intense. So I'm skipping that part. There are so many other codes category just to give you an idea about first cycle coding. There are several ways to code it. You can go through the Saldana's coding manual in very much of detail. He addresses all the other categories of coding. So what do we do after the first cycle of coding? We sort of start reading out the codes. Suppose we coded 50 interviews. We had generated 30 codes, let's say 30 different codes, which are repeating itself in various interviews. Okay, so then you see, these codes, you compile them together in a Word file, and then you look for a reference. Step A is to find relationship between codes. Are a group of codes making reference to a specific concept? You try to see, okay, there are so many things which people said, I have coded it, 30 codes I have got. Are these code number 1, code number 8, code number 20, code number... asking questions to the code. So that way you reach the abstraction of the data. Then the second thing you can ask them, I hope I'm audible to you. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It was...
There was a slight break, but then... Hello? Hello? Ma'am, call, ma'am.
Hello, I guess there is certain interruption because Balaji sir is having a Wi-Fi issue.
Ma'am, I'd like to know if uh,
Yes.
these presentations would they be shared in a PDF format to us?
We will check with the speakers and get back to you.
Because most of the information, one time we seeing it, I don't think it's getting really registered. So
Yeah,
maybe for a review.
Lots of information.
Yeah.
Probably, I don't know, make your own.
I'm jotting down, but still there is there's certain things.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. We will try.
Please
We
let
will
us know,
try our
ma'am.
best. We'll have to check out with COA and the speakers how it goes, and we'll get back.
All right. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
I think I've connected back. Can you hear me?
Sir, we lost connection. Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
I'm extremely
you're back.
sorry for the internet disconnection.
No problem, sir.
Especially when these subjects are heavy ones and you cannot dilute it. These breaks are sort of creating hindrance.
Yeah, we can't help that, sir. No problem. Yeah.
Okay. So at the end of the lecture, I'm going to give you a sort of, links to various books and courses that you can take, free courses that you can take from internet. If interested people can certainly go through that. In fact, I have uploaded Johnny Saldano's book and a few more books, couple of books onto the drive, and the links I'm going to share by the end of it. I guess that will help you.
Yes, sir, that's perfect. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, so just for you to get oriented to the subject, I'm giving you some pointers, but I think it definitely helps if you go through in detail from these books. Okay, so I was just saying, after the first cycle of coding, what we do is find out certain things from the code. Then only we get into the second cycle of coding. So what all we do, we find the first thing, relationship between the codes. Are there any relationship between different codes? For example, is there a particular concept that several codes are referring to, a particular concept towards which all the codes are pointing to? You can note down those. Occurrence is a very important analysis after the first cycle of codes. How does a group of codes happen? For example, you can say a code indicating a particular process in architecture. Let's say we are researching construction process. Okay, then we are seeing high-tech construction. Suppose one of the code is high-tech construction. How many times that has occurred in a set of interview? 30 times, 40 times. Certain other code has appeared only once. Certain other codes are all over. In all the interviews it is there. Okay, so that indicates sort of how important a particular subject is, particular theme is. So you also count it. Sequence the code in an order. Which code appears before a certain code in all the interviews? Which code appears later? So we try to find the relationship between the codes first. Code frequencies are counted. Underlining meanings are assessed. So after the first cycle of coding, we sort of try to analyze the codes and see if there are any relationships, how many times they occur. Second cycle of coding is a broader type of coding. It's not just name, age. It's not just a small concept or process. It's after the first cycle coding, we are trying to find the pattern. So again, once again, you go through the interview data and code it for the patterns. Okay, I'm not going into detail of all these types, but in a nutshell, the second cycle of coding is to look at larger theories, larger pattern. If there are any larger trends visible, for example, after the first cycle of coding, you may understand there is a trend. Okay, there is a growing concern for hygiene in a locality. Suppose there is a growing means it's a pattern. Decreasing, is another pattern. Spreading wide, it's another pattern. So these kind of patterns you can, find out. Okay. So second cycle of coding is to do with all kind of pattern finding and theories. So what do you do with all these codes and the patterns once you have received them? How to present them? This is chapter 4 of Saldana's, material I'm referring to, where, as I said right in the beginning, writing down a quantitative paper is relatively easier because you know sort of what mathematical calculation, what table to present, how to describe them, and finally state. But how to present the findings in a paper, when you're writing a qualitative research paper, after you have coded the data and observed for the patterns, how can you write the paper step by step? So point 1, provide a background information about participants or the observer. Especially the first cycle coding you can use here. While writing a paper, you should keep the codes in front of you so that it gives you the idea for what kind of themes to pick up. So first step, you will describe all the participants, their background information. This comes from the first cycle coding. Presenting the coding strategies use number of codes, categories, and themes emerged. You can also write in the paper itself, qualitative research paper. You can also represent one section of the paper dedicated for the methodology. What kind of coding strategy have you used? How did you categorize them? How did you thematize them? This you can write. Third step in the presenting the findings in a paper is to start systematically investigating each of your codes. For example, you can start by stating each theme. You must have identified, let's say, 4 to 5 themes by the process of coding. You can start stating them one by one. What is the theme 1? What is theme 2? What is theme 3? Describe them, describing what the theme stands for. What is the description for each of the themes? Suppose we are describing, we have come to a conclusion that theme 1 represents gender inequality in a particular locality. Safety concerns is the second theme. The third concern must be to do with sanitation and hygiene, etc. So you have identified broader themes, and then you can start describing one after the other. Supporting the theme with evidence. This is where the quotation comes into place. You must have collected in the process of coding, you would have collected a lot of in vivo coding and quotations from the participants, what the participants themselves told you. So you can, in the paper, while explaining the themes, you can throw in a few quotations here and there, stating that suppose you're talking about gender inequality in a settlement, you can talk about it as your findings, and you can say few of the participants said this in the quotation marks. So that will sort of help you validate your own findings. Then showing how the findings address the research question. This is the most important thing. You have described all the findings, the themes. Finally, you have to say, how does it help me address the research question? You can also make a finding summary table. This will help you for yourself to look at the table and write it down in detail. Okay, so for example, you can make a table like this, where one of the column represent the category or theme 1, 2, 3, meaning in a very brief manner, one sentence meaning of that particular theme. You can copy all the quotations from the field as evidence from the data. So you can paste it in that table. So you will have an entire table, what to write. Then when you start writing your paper, you can always pick up theme by theme and explain it in detail, quote from the evidence. So this table will help you sort of write the paper. Presenting the relationship between themes. Theme 1, 2, 3 separately described is one thing, but across the themes, how they are linked to. For example, you can say theme 1 is education of the particular community you are surveying. Theme 2 is the maintenance of certain infrastructure in the locality. Okay, separately you described, but then now you identified because of the education, poor education of the community, they're not able to maintain in their infrastructure. So that is a relationship between the first theme and the second theme. Now you can try to look for these themes and then write about it. Lastly, you can also create diagrams to show the relationship between the theme. You can make various diagrams. You can show it like a flow chart. So see, the general process will range from site interview. Then you will come back and transcribe these interviews. Sometimes, because most of the time what you do in the site is to interview in your local language. Suppose in Karnataka I'm interviewing, then most of the time my interview will be in Kannada. In Maharashtra, it will be in your own local language, so on and so forth. So audio recordings has to be brought back and you have to transcribe them. Wear a headphone, listen to it and type it down. Then you can start coding all your typed down information into smaller labels. Then you find the theme and finally you start making interrelationships and analysis. In a nutshell, this is going to be the process. So as a summary of coding process, first, assign labels to your research question, anchor codes. These codes are called anchor codes because you go to the field not without any research question. By this time, I'm sure in the previous sessions, you have already been spoken to about research questions and hypotheses and things like that. I'm assuming that. And then I'm going ahead because the first code you will assign to is to the research question itself, not to the interview data. This is called anchor code because later all the other codes that comes from the field, we always see how does it relate to the anchor code. Code relevant statements and putting the codes under their respective anchor code. Okay, you can use comments, endnote function, etc. Multiple coding methods depending on type of research. Not getting in so much of detail, just a summary of coding process. Once the coding is done, you can compile a list of initial coding, group codes into their respective anchor codes. You can tally the frequency, count each of the code. I'll show you some other slide of coding being done also, so that it will be more clearer to you. Okay, you can tally the frequency, count them, and then write down the numbers also. Generate categories from the code, broader themes. Examine the categories to generate themes. Use the themes to address the research question. So it is never, as usually the amateur researcher does, it is never going and collecting data from the field, interview from the field. Next step, jumping into the final findings. It's never that. There are these intermediate steps which we have to follow to systematically do the interpretation. Otherwise, our interpretation might be biased. So this is one example. This is the step 2, using specific coding methods to code relevant statements. You can see it is coded in MS Word. You can use any kind of software. Manually also you can code data. For example, MS Word is something which you can very, very easily use. MS Word you can use. You can also use Google Docs. I also use Google Docs. If you want to go for advanced coding techniques, you have other softwares as well, which I will show you in a while. So this is one example where you can see interview data as in how the interview was done. Exactly the content is typed out as a transcription. Can you see on the left hand side? On the right hand side, using comment function from MS Word, one has highlighted portions of the interview, and in the comment, the reduced codes are written. For example, 2 sentences, the first 2 sentences are highlighted, and then in the comment, it's written, initial need is the anchor code, lack of interest in academic work. So that whole 2 sentence just means, in essence, lack of interest in academic work. That's the code. So you can start looking things like that. For example, another code here I can see, senses of isolation and loneliness. That's another code. The interviewer, the respondent might be telling you stories and a lot of other things, relevant and irrelevant things. Our duty is to record everything, but then pick those that are relevant and assign a code to that. Then it's easier for us to make interpretations meaningful. Now, once the coding is done, you can see here, coding is done randomly according to the data. They are not in alphabetical order. The next step is to compile the codes into alphabetical order. Now I will keep the interview data aside. Since I have already coded my data, I'll only work with the codes. That way it gives you a researcher's freedom to play around the data, play around the codes. So one of the activities you can do is alphabetically arrange them. Why does it help? Suddenly you start seeing, ability, you start seeing, certain codes are come together. They come together when you alphabetically arrange them. You see a pattern, that happens when you do that. See here, you can see it says also in the bracket, in all 110 statements from participant were coded. So there is a record of how many statements are coded. What has been coded. There is a record of number of codes. So everything is systematically kept. This is important for a qualitative research. Okay, then what did you do? Group codes into their respective anchor codes. So you can see the codes are a phrase, sense of confidence, reflecting and making plans. So that's a code. Their larger group, okay, code category is these. You can see ability. So for the first 4 code category, there are subcodes. So these are all some ways in which you can organize your code so that it starts making sense to you, starts giving you patterns. Then 44 codes and their respective frequencies are calculated. Now you can see numbers in the bracket. Certain code came only once, certain codes twice, certain codes 10 times, reaching out to students in need. 10 times the code has appeared, which means that sort of gives you an idea about what is important in the data, which one is occurring more frequently, what is not so important, what is a code which you need not address so much. That idea you'll get. So the frequency can also be graphed. These are softwares which are used, of course, to code the qualitative data. Now, once the coding is done and you have the numbers, you can always generate a graph to see how many times a certain code has appeared. Religion as a code has appeared how many times. Something else appeared how many times. You can always look at the frequency. You can do one more exercise called co-occurrence. Once the codes are ready, you can put them together and see how many times 2 codes appear together or 3 codes appear together. That same thing is generated as a graph here. You can see on the right hand side, what is done is same set of codes are taken on X and Y axis. You can see that duration, reading by mother, routine, etc., bedtime routine. Same codes are taken here. Now we can see, certain codes appear together. For example, you can see here reading by others, letter recognition. What is this in their context of research? We don't know. Okay, I'm not getting into that. You can do it for your own research. You can put these codes across to see which 2-3 codes appear together. In graphical form, it is even more helpful. You can see here, these are all codes on the left hand side in the bubble. Clean energy is a code, civil rights is a code, housing crisis is a code, taxes are code, healthcare is a code. But you can see very clearly job, education, healthcare, family issues, taxes, they are clustered together, which means they appear together. Within an interview, perhaps 50 people out of 100 people have spoken about healthcare, education, job together. Hardly anybody spoke about civil rights, justice. That's why they are far away like that. Okay, so this gives you an idea about which are the codes you should look together and which are the codes you should independently address. So generate these exercises of frequency, co-occurrence, etc. will give you an idea about what kind of themes, larger themes can be pulled together. So this is an example again from the MS Word only. I'm using simple software as example so that everybody sort of relates. One can, tomorrow, if you want to just start the exercise, you can simply open a Word file and start doing this. So here you can see how the codes has been further grouped, frequency calculated, and they're color coded. And then larger themes now, pertaining to research questions are being answered using the codes. So this is one way of organizing your codes. You can do it as you please. In traditional method, it was being done using post-its pinned up on a pin board. All these were being done. So we can also use manual methods to do this. This is my own example. I was studying for my PhD. I was studying places and landscapes that are related to music. So I was looking at and interviewing people to understand if musicians relate themselves to landscapes. Is music, which they produce has any connection to the landscapes? So here you can see I am interviewing a particular musician, RKP, and I have asked him certain questions. How do you relate your practice to the place? So he has given me several running paragraphs. one of the exercise I did is to break down all his sentences into numbers. Can you see 7, 8, 9, 10? This is part of a larger interview. Okay, the interview runs for several pages. So I am showing you somewhere in between. So I first broke down his interviews into separate lines so that I can already see certain patterns. Then those parts of those lines, I've started commenting on that as codes. Now, can you see? So one of my code is sense of space during music performance. He's saying, I have always felt a strong connection between my performance and the environment I am situated in. This is the sentence he told me. So I made a sense of it and then made a code sense of space during music performance. This will start appearing twice, thrice, several places in several interviews. So I will group them into one category, sense of space. That is how I will go about it. See the second sentence, 8 sentences, Laya of the river Kaveri has always inspired my composition because this particular musician is based in Rudrapatna, which is on Kaveri's bank. So he says Laya of the tempo of the Kaveri river has inspired me. So I have written a code saying nature as inspiration to music. This way I have collected numerous codes. I drew down somewhere around 30 codes by end of my collection of interviews. Not only this interview, but multiple interviews. These codes start appearing again and again and again. That is when I know these codes are certain codes are important for me to pursue as a research. This is another exercise of my same research where I have coded this time, not the interview, but this time all the inscriptions from various temples. Okay, so I have collected all the inscriptions, translated them into English, and then the location of from various temples, the inscriptions have been collected or put up into paragraphs. From the inscriptions, what is important for me that I have pulled out and coded. Here you can see one of the inscriptions from the Bradeshwara temple of Tanjore. So there is a paragraph says it also employed, the temple also employed 240 musicians. A wealth of Tamil inscriptions in the temple provided information on the endowments of that Rajaraja Chola created to patronize dancers, villages they came from, and the streets around the temple where they lived. This is the sentence from the inscription. So I coded it as patronization of performing arts. So this patronization will start appearing in several of my other data also. So I know that is a theme which I have to write in my paper. Patronization is something I can write. As evidence, this will also be in my tabulation that I will use these as my evidence to validate my findings. So similarly, you can see another sentence from Chidambaram temple. An inscription says something about the temple sculptures. So I have coded it as temple sculptures represent content from musical treatises, so etc. So on and so forth. So this is how you sort of go do the coding and then analyze them. Some software which I want to recommend for you where the coding can be done in the these are all coding softwares. QDA Miner is there. Atlas TI is the one I use. It's not a free software. It has to be a purchased one. Max QDA is another software. NVivo. These are all the softwares you need to purchase. But there are also someone who want to just as a beginner wants to explore can use open source softwares which are free of cost. You can install them on your computer, download it, and free of cost you can install and use it without any copyright issue. So Tagwit and Qualcoder are two such softwares. Qualcoder is quite elaborate. You can code text, images, videos as well. Tagwit can be used to code only text information, interview and other text information. So I have provided you a QR code for Qualcoder downloading platform. So I'll just pause for a moment. You can interested people can scan it and then store the location. Okay, I'm going ahead. These are some snapshots from the softwares. QDA Miner is one software I had told you. So you can open any kind of Word file or PDF file, etc., where your interview transcriptions are there. So it will display in the center. So there are tools for assigning codes for them, which you can see on the right hand side. Can you see patriotism is a code that appears in blue. Representatives, ethic, globalize. These codes start appearing. You can nest the codes also, one within the others. For example, globalization and representatives. Next, there are subcodes within them. All these the software allows you to do. And then it automatically creates on the left hand side, you can see the nested diagram for codes. So when you click each of the codes, it will start showing what you have highlighted in the data, etc. So you can sort of, while writing down your paper, you can sort of, once you finished your coding, you can click these items, start making sections for the paper, start extracting evidences for your paper easily using the software. So that is what it helps you for. Now there is another example from the QDA Miner software for image coding. Can you see certain part of the image is highlighted here, which the software allows you to do. You can highlight, the rectangle, draw a rectangle on part of image, and you can code that part also. So later when you're writing the paper, you can always just copy that particular part and paste it in your paper when you're writing about that particular theme. So I'm just pausing for a moment so that you can see what is all happening on the page. There is a painting, there are images that are coded, emblematic image, secondary figures, etc. On the left hand side, I can see landscape, trees, animals. So these are certain codes. Painter, century, title, all that can be noted down. So the analysis is easier for you. So the other thing you can do is to generate word clouds. Suppose counting the code and looking at the numbers are not very helpful for you. You can just, use these softwares. There are a lot of online softwares available. Free wordcloudgenerator.com is one such, where you can upload your Excel sheet. You must have maintained all your codes in an Excel sheet. You can upload it and it can generate you a word cloud. There are many softwares like that. I'm sure many of you know it. So then you can easily highlight which codes are more prominent, which codes are not prominent. Now stigma comes out in a big font, which means several times that particular code has been used. Health comes out as a big font, which means in that Excel file you have fed in the software, health has been appearing several times. So you know the importance of various codes by visualizing them. So you can visualize using many other softwares. Some of the online mind mapping software, MindMap, Canva, Lucid Chat, MindMeister, these are also there where you can very easily use and mind map these code. You can borrow the codes into these softwares and sort of develop your own mind map so that you understand the relationship between you write it down as a paper. So this is another thing, another way of mind mapping where you're not just mapping it as arrow mark and the various codes. You're also highlighting the track, okay, with the code which you want to highlight. The primary theme running across the mind map can be highlighted in bold, color coded. So you can always use these methods. I generally don't prefer color coding as much because already it is a boiled down data. So I highlight what is important for me and then I go on those narrative. So I know this is the highlighted code is called axial code. Okay, so that I know now when I start a paper, I have to start from that part because that is the most important line of codes for me, the ones in the bold. Yeah, I think more or less I have spoken about all the content that is relevant to code. Only when you further explore it, you will really be able to apply it to your work, and then you will be able to understand the significance of this kind of a work. So my first recommendation to you is the coding manual itself by Johnny Saldana, whose book I have used extensively to generate this presentation as well. The coding manual for qualitative researchers. Please scan the QR code. The soft copy of this book I have placed it in this Google Drive link, so you can download it. Just pausing for a moment. Now, other two books I want to recommend, which although is not directly related to what I spoke today, references to coding is still there. But if you are interested in the larger qualitative research, these two are excellent books. The soft copies, again, I have placed it in this QR code link. You can scan it and download the books for yourself. Constructing Grounded Theory by KHATRI Charmas, and the other one is Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research Methods. Grounded Theory is elaborative work which I will recommend that reading for later, not for an advanced work reader. Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research is good for beginners because this is formatted in the form of encyclopedia, not as detailed chapters. So suppose you want to know about coding, qualitative coding, you can go to that, it's in alphabetical order. So you can go to the page of coding, and then within 2 to 3 pages with examples, very nice descriptions are provided. So I recommend beginners to start with the Sage Encyclopedia of Qualitative Research. I'm pausing for a moment for you to scan. These two are courses. Now, those 3 books are helpful for you for longer run. There are 2 little courses which you can always take up. Professor Aradhna Malik's IIT Kharagpur's course called Qualitative Research Methods and Research Writing. This is available on NPTEL as well as Swayam platform. Currently, I checked, this course is not doing a rerun currently. Earlier it used to be offered. But this link which I have provided here takes you to the archival material, which means you can still see the content. All the videos are available, but free of cost. But you cannot take an examination for that as of now. So you can keep checking on Swayam platform whether this course is provided for later, for you to take it up for a certification. You can always do that. One is MIT Qualitative Research Methods, Data Coding and Analysis. This is specifically on coding and analysis offered by MIT, part of their course. I hope you have scanned these two. I'm moving ahead. So let's do a small, I think we have 10 minutes left. So I would like to do a quick exercise. Is that okay? I would request coordinators to respond. Do we have time to do a little exercise?
Yes, sir, sure.
Okay, very small exercise, so that you get your hands on it and get started. Okay, so I'm on this slide. You can see 2 questions, interview questions. Let's assume this is a research done, and architects are being interviewed to find out about the scenario of architecture. Now, let's assume that is the researching field. So 2 questions I have given you and respondents' answers also in quotation marks. So I would like all of you to try out, assigning some codes. How would you go about in assigning some codes? And then you can type out in the chat box itself. Type out the codes which you see wherever you can see. Of course, in this medium of conversation, we cannot highlight a particular sentence and assign code and specifically point out. You can just type out the codes which you feel is valid for assigning and type out in the chat box. Let's see how it comes out. Okay, I cannot see the chat box. Is there anything typed? I'm not sure.
We
You
are
can
getting
apply.
answers, sir. We are getting answers. We just say.
Okay. Try to think about in vivo coding, which means pulling out the words from the respondent's answer itself. Try to think about various other kinds of coding we mentioned, attribute coding, emotional coding. So think what you can code.
I'll read out. We got few answers, sir.
Yeah.
One is client communication.
Okay.
Given by Rajshri, and passion given by Anudita.
Okay.
By architect Koteshwar to improve the built form.
Yeah. Great.
By Rupa Jawal, people, buildings, and passion.
Okay.
Aparna Bhattacharya, client communication.
See, now you can already see client communication appeared twice. Passion appeared twice. So imagine you doing this exercise for a large amount of data. And then when codes start coming up and repeating, you will start seeing these patterns. Yeah. So then it gives you themes to write about this particular work. Yeah.
I continue reading, sir.
Sorry?
Should I continue reading the codes?
Yeah, you can read a few more.
Okay. Client skill communications by Shubhojit. People by Kevin.
Yes.
Skill by Aparna Bhattacharya. Aarti Daga has written Passion for People, Passion for Building, Functional Building. Prasad, Architect Prasad has written Goal, Communication with Clients, Relations. And again, we have communication,
Wonderful.
communication skill. So
Wonderful.
the answers are
Thank you. Thank you. I
they're
think that's
coming.
nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. So now we're all getting a sense of what it comes up to, no? So imagine doing various exercise, and when you have codes like this, you start counting the frequency, you start organizing it in alphabetical order. Then the theme sort of in an unbiased way manner, the theme start flashing to our minds. Otherwise, what happens? You look at the interviews, we would be thinking during the interview certain angle of thought, and then we carry it back home, and without looking at the data seriously, we start interpreting. So it becomes pseudo analysis. Now, when we do this exercise, a lot of places we get surprised by ourselves. When we are doing the coding, we realize, oh, but I thought in the field something else was a main theme, but codes tell me something else. It is telling me the other story. So these kind of insights start cropping up in your mind. So I would strongly recommend all of you who are interested in qualitative research to try out coding techniques for your interviews. You can start in a small way for a small paper, wherever you're conducting some interviews, you can start doing that. Even the visual material can be coded, which might be a slightly complex process, but it's the same technique. Thank you very much. I would like to close the session with this note. Open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for adding to the knowledge being acquired at the faculty development program. Now the session is open for question and answer. Any queries from the participants, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Ma'am, I had a question for sir.
Please.
Yeah, so very nice presentation, because I think there's always a confusion with coding and themes. I just wanted to understand when you said that, presently I'm working on a research paper which talks about education during COVID, basically. So we have interviewed people and we have a respondent set of around 160-65 people. And in that, there is a mix of qualitative and quantitative research is what we've come to the conclusion. But
Okay.
what is happening is, so it was not an interview, it was a questionnaire. So I wanted to understand that, suppose in this we had sent out a questionnaire and then we've divided into qualitative and quantitative. If I'm doing a face-to-face interview or an online interview, that can also categorize as qualitative and quantitative, or interviews are always qualitative?
No, see, actually, interviews generally develop as a qualitative data, because if you ask a question, the respondent is going to say things related to that, isn't it? They won't usually, stop after responding yes or no or something like that. Okay, maybe when you ask what is the age and things like that, income group or whatever, they will give you one answer. But otherwise, if you say, what do you think about the sanitation of the place, the respondent is going to give a list of answer, expressions, emotions, all that is going to be there. So they mostly fall under qualitative. One more thing I want to add to what you were asking, I was noticing you said COVID time this one education you are researching, and then you started with only questionnaire and not the interview, detailed interview.
Yeah.
Actually, ideally, the process is always qualitative research precedes the quantitative research, which means it has to be done before quantitative. What will you quantify? That is the question. No, what do you quantify? That comes from the qualitative findings. Suppose if had I done a detailed interview with a selected few participants, somewhere as a pilot, then I got all the whole list of qualitative data. We call it in technical terms rich data. Rich data means it's mixed, too many things mixed together. Okay, and rich data is coded, and finally certain themes are pulled out. Then we know precisely these are the 8 themes. These are the 5 categories for which I need quantification. So in general sense, generally if for a subject not very well known already, qualitative research precedes the quantitative research. Then the quantitative follows to quantify them. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. So basically, but it can be a combination also, right?
Combination. You have to plan it that way. Not that
Okay,
it happened
because-
by accident.
Yeah. I know, but this is what we did is once we got the content, we are already working on the quantitative analysis and we've almost had, I mean, we did something different from what you are saying. So we came up with the quantitative analysis, and since some questions were still not addressed and used in the quantitative analysis, we're using that data to come up with a qualitative research paper. So
Okay.
so I just wanted to understand that it can be a mix of two, right? I mean, the interview that you're doing.
Absolutely can be a mix of two. It's called mixed research only. See, in any for any practical purpose, I don't think anyone does purely quantitative work or purely qualitative work, especially concerned with our domain of architecture and planning. This is not a domain where you can absolutely confine something to exclusively qualitative and quantitative. It has to be a mixed research most of the time. It will only the process I was trying to elaborate. But yeah, what you're doing is absolutely fine, I think.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Is another method to interpret that.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon.
Hello. Yes, it was a informative session, sir. I have a question, sir. So, how this coding will help us to formulate the research questions, and is it help us to narrow down and filter our the data? So, I wanted to know this. Means how it will help.
I think that is where it will help you. It will narrow down and filter the data. That is what we are doing in the coding process by applying filters, isn't it? The labels are nothing but filters. We are taking chunks of paragraphs of things which people said, and you're assigning labels to them. So that is sort of narrowing down your area. It allows you to focus on important parts of your research. But another question you asked is very interesting. What you said is, how does it help me in formulating my research question? Because in the presentation, I didn't talk about that. I said your research question also, you put an anchor code and then see other codes, how it feeds into the anchor code, how it addresses the research question. But can we use coding for arriving at a research question? Yes, when we do a pilot survey. See, before getting into the field for an elaborate research, we do sample pilot survey, reconnaissance we call it. Okay. In the pilot survey, keep your mind very, very open. There is no research question in your mind, nothing. You are just collecting data and then looking at the pilot survey, you code it. It will be a smaller exercise, not elaborate coding like later. That code will sort of indicate what theme you should, develop it as a research question. So that way it will help you formulate the research question as well. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir. It was very informative. Thank you, sir.
There's a question in the chat box, sir.
Okay.
That was a very, this is from Professor Indra Kohli, ma'am.
Yes.
She says, sir, it was a very wonderful presentation.
Thank
I
you.
am writing a paper on ancient kingdoms, mean Prisley Palace architecture. How coding can help in this?
Coding can help you in a lot of manner. Like, for example, I can imagine if you're working on princely palaces, then suppose you're working on living palaces, say Rajasthan or Mysore, there are still royal families still there. And then they carry the legacy of these palaces. So interview, I'm assuming you will do elaborate interview with these families. So then once you get the interview data, you will have to code to find out, filter the data to get the most important essence of what it is. One way. The second thing is, I am sure if you're working with palaces, you will get a lot of visual material, photographs, and you'll get videos. So in one of the slides, I showed you how a painting can also be coded. So similarly, you can have, like, say, suppose you have 8 palaces, different photographs. Okay, and its context, let's assume. So you can start coding these. One example is, suppose I have a picture of palace with their context. One context is a flourishing urban area. The other context for the palace is a slum, which can happen in today's context. So I start coding them on the image itself. Slum being the context, urban area being the context. So out of 8, probably 4 of the palaces have urban area as the context. So urban area will become urban context will become my one code. Another thing will become my other code. And so this way you can develop codes for images as well as the interviews. I hope I answered your question, ma'am.
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, yes. Clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any more questions, participants?
Can't hear.
Participants, any more questions?
Participants. Participants, are there any more questions? Participants, you can type your questions later in the chat box and we will share it with the speaker. Thank you.
You are on mute. Can't hear.
So I think we come to the close of the session. If you still have any questions, you can type them in the chat box and we'll forward it to sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. I take honor to propose the vote of thanks at the end of the first session of the third day. On behalf of JPRAC, our grateful thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Balaji Venkatachary, who spoke so clearly on the topic of basics of qualitative coding for architecture research. Thank you so much, sir. We also thank our director and principal, Professor Architect Gayatri ma'am, for this opportunity given, and also for your extensive guidance, sir, Director, sir, of the COA-TRC, Dr. Navneet Munot. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you all participants for attending. And before we close the session, we'll take attendance. I mean, you will have to switch on your video.
Before I leave, I'd like to thank heartily Council of Architecture and JBR College, all the people who have worked behind this. And my hearty thanks to all the participants who has kept the patience to listen to my session. Thank you very much. We'll try and keep touch in the future as well.
That was a great presentation, sir. Thank you so much. And if you want to leave, you can leave at this point, sir. We're taking in the attendance. We're waiting for participants to switch on your camera. Just a moment before we close. There are a few more who haven't switched on their cameras. So we are done with the first session. Now over to the second session and over to Professor Afri to moderate for the second session.
Good afternoon, one and all. I think we are 10 minutes ahead of schedule. We would expect participants to be, interactive and ask questions, and also their email address of the speaker usually shared at the last slide of his presentation. Any questions, please make sure that you coordinate with us and forward it also. Good afternoon, one and all. I welcome you all to the second session of the third day proceedings. Without any further ado, I take honor of introducing our eminent speaker, Professor Anand Khatri, for the second session. Anand Khatri is a senior architect and the founding director of Urban Village Charitable Trust, a research repository working on urban informalities. He is professor and the head of the research cell at AIT SAB and also an alumni of the Department of Conservation in SPA Delhi. Professor Anand is a poet and has published several anthologies. He has been working on intersemantic exchange of art and urbanization and connects poetry, architecture, traditional dance, forms, and theater, speaks on poetry as a healing art. With the Overseas Economic Cooperation Fund, OECF Japan, through Water and Power Consultancy Services India Limited, in 1996, Professor Anand worked on conservation strategy for the 5 ghats in Vrindavan and Mathura. In the year 2005, he was consultant with Punjab Heritage Tourism and Promotion Board. Huh? My voice is not there.
Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think
Okay.
there's a little network issue.
Okay.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
I should continue or yeah. So in the year 2005, he was a consultant with Punjab Heritage and Tourism Promotion Board. Professor Anand Khatri, sir, has worked with MOPR on GPSDP plans for a village in January 2021. Professor Anand Khatri, sir, is now a part of the prestigious G20 Think 20. His policy for inclusive cities was accepted by G20 countries in the year 2022. His research expertise, village people, policy, poetry, and planning, urban villages of Noida, and understanding the limitation and the incapabilities of URDP, FI, and master plans in the settlement areas of Uttar Pradesh are his ongoing researches. He's eagerly looking out to work in areas that has escaped the focus of planned development. I now take honor of inviting Professor Anand Khatri, sir, to brief the eager participants for today's session on the important topic of historic research, ways and means of doing qualitative and quantitative historical research. Professor.
Thank you so much, Afreen, for this introduction. I hope my voice is clear. Before I start speaking, I want to check my file share. Can I do it right now?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Yeah. Is my file visible to all of you on the screen?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay. So good. So I have 1 hour to speak, right? And my topic is on historic research frameworks. So I will be keeping my video off for convenience, and I will be speaking on this subject. But before I start speaking, I must thank Professor KHATRI and Professor Indra Kohli and Professor Navneet Munot for involving me with this engrossing, FDP, Faculty Development Program at COA-TRC Bhopal and the JBR College of Architecture, Hyderabad. In fact, having these kind of FDPs is a new framework in enhancing the level of education and awareness in our architectural systems. The age to which I belong, I did my BArch in 1993 from GCA Lucknow. And then I did my master's from SPA Delhi in 1996 in historic conservation. Research, in any case, was always a part of architecture, and there are innumerable arguments on research and design, design as research per se. But within the framework of the topic on historic research, the first dialogue that I want to open with you all is on method for historic research and historical research method. So these are two different things. So one thing is talking about the method for historical research, wherein the historical research per se is the thing that we want to do. It is the method for making an inquiry into a historic subject. Like Indra Kohli was saying that she's doing a research on certain historic subject. So she would undertake methods for historic research. But historical research method is an entirely different typology of research, wherein I personally feel that very few researchers in architecture can actually escape the whole subject of historic discussion, whether it belongs to the area of isms, whether it belongs to the area of settlements, whether it belongs to the area of structural development, whichever area in architecture you think of. And we have been tuned to think in a historic research methodology. So historic research methodology, whether it is the case study method, whether it is a cultural study method, it emanates from the historical research. So there is a fine boundary which I want to clarify here in the beginning of the discussion itself, that while seeing the historicity, we have to create this difference between the method for historical research, which can largely be any other research method with a few other additions, like it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, with a little bit of layering discussion, with a little bit of community research tools, and so on and so forth, with a little bit of research on building typologies. But the historical research methods is an addendum to any research wherein we look into historicity. So this is a point that I had wanted to clarify at the inception. Why is not my slide moving? Yeah. Now, the second thing that I wanted to share was that most of us believe that historicity or history is something which can be taken away. The historic focus, is actually a bias also. I am beginning a discussion on the way the world is growing, because I have to position the research activity that we undertake in our day-to-day lives and the research activity that has got inculcated into architecture into the right form. So we must understand that while we grow, as we grow, we are given a lot of biases. So when a child is growing, then a child is taught a lot of things, ways to behave, and so on and so forth. All these are biases which are fed in our system, in our mental thinking. So our mind thinking already comprises of frames. Before getting into research, we must learn to understand these frames. Like in adolescence, most children, they actually, they rebel. All youth rebels. We experiment with our lives. All this experimentation with our lives, all this breaking off of boundaries is a way of breaking the biases which we have been fed in. And research in today's mentally connected world is something which cannot be escaped, because we are together building a new bias. Every day we research, we talk of new things. I give this example to all people with whom I discuss research, that the world today cannot think of the connected world today, the world which is connected and wired so heavily across, cannot really think of the world before this connectedness. I tell them that it was never possible for anyone to track me or trace me in my college, what I was doing, whether I was studying or not. And now we have cameras, now we have WhatsApp, a message reaches us, So the connected world cannot imagine the world of independence. I will call it independence because there was less answerability to the immediacy of the situation. There was very little that was to be shared with people without personal decision making. So that kind of a life and today's life is actually the something which cannot be explained to the person of today. And henceforth there is a mental world that is connecting us, which is through which we are all growing. J. Krishnamurti explains this thing very conveniently by saying that you must adopt thoughts so that it can impregnate the minds of many. Just as a virus impregnates the bodies of many people, so do thoughts. In fact, if we read a little more on wellness, then we realize that the dialogue on wellness, my screen, yeah. So we realize that the dialogue on wellness is something that says that when you are watching the crime, the gore, and so many other things on television, it is impregnating your mind with possibilities. And so does research. So that is the dialogue on biases. And the third thing is that, are we assuming today that we are researching, or are we a part of a system where research is inescapable? I personally feel that we today are in a system where research cannot be escaped, where we have to undertake research. So the structure of the talk on historic research method today is, we will talk a little on the research method, then we'll talk on research biases, and then we will talk on the development of the research argumentation. As an extension to what I had said earlier, we all are now taking up PhDs. I mean, with the new education policy in place, I was attending a COA-TRC, wherein they said that the masters will be, the BARC in itself, the 5 years BARC will become equivalent to a master's program. So I asked a question: will I, who had done my master's after my BARC, become a double master's? So, there is this whole process wherein we are at one end engaging into enhancing the knowledge system, and at the same time, I personally see the engagements of the new educational policy trying to, break into the institution of research and the institution of in-depth systems of education that architecture has developed from. Architecture being a profession, a profession of people who were into building, is today trying to intervene into almost everything by way of research, by way of participation. We are looking into societies, culture, planning, urbanization. We have developed many folds, and it is this development of knowledge system from a professional field. It's just like a person who is a delivery person becoming Amazon, or a carpenter becoming a big institution. I mean, I'm giving economic examples, but maybe if you see the similarity in scale, we have advanced very far. So coming back to the historic research method, I will be relating the historic research method to architecture, the use of historic research methods as in architecture. So we will see how the case study research methods, how the transact study research methods, how the PRA tools in communities and local researches like STS, science, technology, and sociology, which is generally taken up by sociologists, it gets into architecture. Then after a brief discussion on this, or while we are doing a brief discussion on this, we will have a discussion on bias and how biases are intrinsic to research, how certain biases need to be elaborated and declared. Now, while identification of observations in the process of research in itself is a bias, because it is biased by your findings, it is more about what research, it was more about the research dialogue, what intertextuality research is getting into. And then we will be looking at the argument towards the synthesis of information. So I have tried to structure this discussion on historic research methods with reference to architecture in these three areas. Just a second. My slide is moving a little slowly. So now in historic research methods, I have to share the first and the most important definition of historic with you. Historic is a big umbrella. Now, under this word historic, we view connected, disconnected, and living histories. At levels from where you are researching, you can realize that, certain things are living in oral histories, certain things are disconnected in oral histories, and certain things are connected through oral histories. Similarly, sociologically, say, for example, if you are researching on a historic settlement of 1800s or 1600s, and if through the knowledge of some text, the social construction of that time is connected to the social construction of communities around those areas today, then it is connected. But if you are making the observation from a standpoint of an urbanite living in Delhi or Bombay, which is very remote from that sociological context, and you cannot relate to those historic values or those historic, social constructs, then it is absolutely disconnected. And then there could be some kind of historic ethnography wherein you could find living traces of those things because you are yourself a part of it. So history as an umbrella term is a very wide term, but while reorganizing data in history, the most important things that comes to the fore is that history by itself can be felt to be connected or absolutely disconnected. I'll give you a few examples. There were, while doing conservation, there was this big discussion with Nalini Thakur, and we still keep on calling her for certain advices, and she keeps on putting in her words of wisdom to us. And so, or maybe when I consult with my practicing friends in conservation, so we all have this discussion that where is history stopping, at least in India, because crafts which were practiced, they might be disappearing, but they are not disconnected. So the building craft is there. So is age only a marker? I mean, is the chronological process of creation only a marker of history, or are there any more markers? What is it that we call as history is to be understood. Say, for example, that we still have certain set of communities which are working online. Say, for example, we still have a certain set of communities which are handcrafting, stonework and handcrafting buildings with a chisel and a hammer. And they are doing handcrafted sculptures. So the question of the word historic in the process of research is, do you really call something historic because it was made in a particular era? Or can you see continuity in that historic process, despite the knots that have been created by discontinuous, activities that have happened? Maybe chronology could be one way of looking at it, but there are other social, cultural, process related, social society of workers related. There are many other, frames through which you can see historical continuity, despite the dates being shifted by 100 years, 200 years, and so on and so forth. Now, coming down to research, which I think in this workshop or otherwise also is you all would be aware, but I see research as a circle because it comes from the word search. So while re is important, search is equally important. So search per se is actually originating from the word ring. So when we are researching, we are actually completing a circuit. In historical researches methods, the first and the foremost important thing is to be able to relate to and appreciate a thing the way it was functioning then, to reconstruct the missing pieces of information. And that in itself is a big achievement in historic researches. So historic researches are actually ones wherein you are talking of the object of your research, but by way of completing the missing argument. This is one, that is the word research that would contribute to the historic research methods. And when we talk about methods, then we talk about the progression of logics. So here with these diagrams and with the help of the next slide on intertextuality, I mean, this is definitions, this is this. Yeah. Okay, I'll come to intertextuality a little later. So the method of research is actually a progression between two statics, so we are moving from one point to the other, or we are moving across points. As Balaji was talking in terms of codings, we are developing the whole research arguments. In the historic research methods, there are certain biases which have to be identified right at the beginning. The first bias being that it is historic. The second bias being whether it is connected history or disconnected history. And that can be quantified and proved at the end of the historic research. That is also possible. But in general, certain biases of being an architect, certain biases of being of researching in a historical area which does not exist anymore, are biases which are born right at the beginning. So these pointers, these statics are things which are areas through which the method of historic research or method of any research progresses. Now coming down to, I mean, this slide would be more or less a repetition of all that I had said. So let's move to the dialogue on intertextuality first, before I go back to the previous diagram. Now, intertextuality is a concept that concerns the fact that all texts derive from others, previous texts, and so have much of their meaning in relation to these texts. So say, for example, if I am speaking something, then, or maybe say, for example, if Kevin Lynch was talking something, so then the subtext of what he was talking has to be understood. Where is Kevin Lynch coming from? What is his training? Is he a planner or an architect? If he's an architect, is he coming from a design base? What are his accomplishments? And if he's a planner, is he trying to identify certain structures within the urban, because of which he's coming up with terms like, imageability, legibility, and he's trying to find out certain definitives inside urbanization. So these are all researches in intertextuality. These are all the subtexts of your studies. Say, for example, we research on this Geddes, right? And then we try to understand why Geddes was talking about words like morphology, anatomy, and so on and so forth. So we will realize that it was a part of his training that he was looking at urban in a very biological way, So historic research does not have many direct inferences, but it has to undergo this whole dialogue of intertextuality, how things were connected. That becomes very, very, very important. And by way of this slide, beyond the dialogue on intertextuality, I have tried to explain that a research could actually amplify itself into different researches, or maybe there could be different research focuses. This slide is actually an extension of the previous diagrams which I had shown, wherein there were 2 points and there were certain lines moving successively between those 2 points. So I had tried to explain in these researches that, somewhere say for example, if there is a research on structural systems in 1800s, right? So one particular research has been done. Now, if you have a dialogue of research on structural systems in 1800s through the British colonies or in the British colonies, then this becomes an independent research. The same subject, if you look from the pre-machine age, it becomes a new research. The same subject, when you start viewing from the lenses of buildings in the arts and crafts movement, it becomes an absolutely new research. So coming back, and there are two more examples, maybe, the structural thought before 1900s, the research on structural systems in 1800s, prior to the new structural thought of modernism in 1900s, and research on structural systems in the age of Renaissance. So while recognizing and understanding intertextuality leads to a much richer reading experience, which invites new interpretations as it brings another context, idea, story into the text at hand is there. But understanding this intertextuality as a part of the research method, which these three diagrams are showing here, is the most important thing. The frame of historic research has to be very carefully selected, because the research circle and can get completed only when the research frames and the research biases are very clearly pronounced. And in research, if you are able to establish your research bias and you are able to bypass and keep certain biases, then your argument develops very, very clearly. I'll give you an example of biases. We do a lot of researches on urban villages coming from UBCT, Urban Village Charitable Trust. And we have a lot of students and student bodies and colleges undertaking these studios and connecting with us. So we generally ask them, so what do you really want to do? So they begin their discussion by saying that urban villages are having a lot of issues. Now, say, for example, I go to an urban village with the whole idea that the urban village is having a lot of issues, so then I already have a confirmation bias, right? And with the confirmation bias, if I start asking questions to people as to what are the kind of issues that you are having in the urban village, then they will definitely say that we have this, this, and this, and this problem. Irrespective of what form of urbanization people belong to, people could talk on issues or problems in their life endlessly. You talk to anybody and these things would be coming to the surface endlessly. So all that I'm trying to say is that confirmation bias right at the beginning of research, right at the beginning of our surveys, is something that prohibits our progress. So most of us feel very energized about research and we feel very committed about research. And henceforth, we really feel very anguished when, when we are questioned in the process of arguments as to how did we reach here. We ourselves are sitting with lots of biases, and these biases have to be surpassed. There has to be a directed energy. This particular diagram before it should have been later, but this diagram somehow in the slides came a little earlier. This diagram is explaining how in a social research or how in a research process, biases do not lead us to take the right actions in research, right? So this was, now this particular intertextuality dialogue in research also tries to say that while somebody is doing a research on a subject, it is very, very possible to change the focus of your observation. And you can also engage or participate in the research process. So research is not restrictive, it is very open. It depends upon its intertextuality. It's like a house where there are lots of people and everybody is talking. So you can go and talk to anyone, but that does not say that the art of talking is belonging only to a certain set of people. Now, these are certain pointers of historic research methods which I wanted to share. The first purpose of historical research, or of researching into history, as they call it, is that historical researches provide important information concerning certain practices. So knowing this is, passe. I mean, it may not be very, it may not give you a very big, good kick to understand this. But if you look at it from the context of planning, if you can look at it from the context of how Delhi is, or if you look at it from the context of our country, then you will realize that a historical research into what form of urbanization we were in, and why we broke off from there, and why we got reduced to shambles, could actually make you understand the whole story. Like Delhi in itself became something which was devoid of all its water, and that is why the capital got shifted. And the megapolis that Delhi is right now, it is actually going to face a similar situation, So a historical research provides important information concerning the effects of certain past practices. It also offers explanation of how and why of many of the theories and practices that has developed and now prevails in schools and colleges. So benefiting from theories which are actually guaranteed by a set of happenings is something that we benefit from. Say, for example, when we look at the conversion of urban form into specific uses in urban villages or in urban informalities, that is one example. It contributes to an understanding of the significance of the phenomena studied. It helps to gain an accurate account of the past, which may not be the objective of your architectural researches, but historic research, definitely it is. It helps to gain a clear perspective of the present. Again, I mean, the last 2 points may not be as much a part of the architectural historical research. So this is just a technique to collect data chronologically so that it could be tested and argued against the present, is how it is defined at a lot of places. But the importance of historic research, this is a technique to collect data and chronologically placed. I mean, I'm repeating the definition. Importance of research is, in the historical research method, is history is the record of changing process. History consists of changes which social structures undergo. Now, here, this particular dialogue I had put because the social method, the inclusion of society in historical researches cannot be overlooked, because that is the social research methods, or the inclusion of social constructs, is something that cannot be alienized to historical research, is what I'm trying to say here. Now, I will explain it by the examples of Varanasi, which I have in my presentation later. But let's see this theory through with the help of the social survey methods. The social research methods are, they are direct, and therein, in the social survey methods, we basically undertake lots of surveys. The intertextuality that we talked about was ideological, but the interrelationship in social survey methods is something which is entirely different. So the social survey method works in tandem with the chronology of dates, and it actually enhances the impact, the causes, and the evolution of culture through the historic argument of chronology. And it tries to give more depth and perspective to it, because most of our understanding in our sciences, in our architectural way of thinking also, is social, although it is very close to cultural, but cultural is also an outcome of the social processes. So in the historic research methods, whenever we are trying to study settlements, historic settlements, society comes at a big role. It plays a big role there. Now, these are tools which I personally feel, when I looked at the schedule of all presentations, then I realized that the quantitative and qualitative tools would have already been discussed. Have they been discussed, Afreen? If you could unmute yourself and tell me, I mean, how much should I take this up is what I am asking.
Yeah, am I audible? Yes, sir. The methods as a tool has been discussed. Both quantitative and qualitative have been discussed.
Yeah. Okay. I was assuming, because initially I was planning to talk on these methods, but when the latest schedule of talks came to me, I realized that this whole dialogue would have definitely been taken up by a couple of more than one speakers. So I will not spend a lot of time here, except for saying that
it has not been, sir, it has not been discussed with respect to the perspective of historical research, but in a general, as a method, it was discussed. Yes.
Okay, fine. So let me, come back to the discussion, and let me come back to the historical research, the importance of historical research and the use of these methods with reference to historical research. So in that case, when we are entering into the diagram of history or the paradigm of historical research, then we have to understand that the qualitative is more important than the quantitative, but qualitative can always be quantified. The qualitative data, say for example, you are collecting local histories, right? And a lot of local history interviews that have happened are talking about one important happening. Then we identify that happening, or we do a cross section of those local interviews or local history interviews, and then we try and say that, okay, I mean, this particular aspect or this particular fact is something that has appeared in so many interviews. This particular fact has appeared in so many interviews. So the whole process of proving or substantiating data in historical research comes from the process of developing arguments around the data collected. So the research process is not the data collection process. The research process is the interpretation process, especially in historic researches. In pure action researches or in pure researches which are trying to seek solutions to day-to-day problems like traffic surveys, or I'm not talking about PhDs, but other researches, then data is directly connected to the output that we are wanting to hear about. But when we are actually looking at qualitative and quantitative data in historical research, then conversion of all possible local histories, conversion of all possible information on plate that is visible on site, that is in the memory of people, that is in the dressing of people, that is in the remnants of cultures, that is in the, lifestyles and employments, that is in the crafts, that is in their languages, dialects, is all very important. I will give you one example. I mean, we were doing a research, like today, somebody was telling me that the hibiscus rosa sinensis is called Java rose. It's called, in Bengali, it's called Java. It was a distortion of Java rose, it was a Java flower or something like that. So in English, it is called Java rose, hibiscus rosa sinensis, China rose, right? And otherwise, in other local dialects, in Orison of descent, or in Jharkhand, it's called the Java flower. So at any given point of time, there is a combination between the red and the rose. There is a connection of Java to all these eastern parts of Indian states, because they are talking about a flower that is of the Java origin. Now, say for example, when we are referring to texts, I will give you another example. In Bihar, there is a festival called Tej, wherein the use of water is all there. So when you look into the texts that are defining the festival, when you do a dialectical analysis of the festival, you realize that they are talking of a term adhartiya. Adhartiya is non-earth. Adhartiya is actually a word that has not got transferred into the Hindi dialect in northern states, which are which are states which are not practicing this particular festival. And it also is getting abolished from the Hindi, the Maithili, the very staunch Hindi of Bihar. But adhartiya is a term that is soft earth on which people stand to do this festival. Now, this particular word, to understand this particular word and to dig this particular word, we undertake certain set of textual researches. But the word in itself is disappearing. So in regions where this festival is taken up, the word is living. And all that I have to say is that even the review of literature and the connection of literature to a certain geomorphological feature is a part of the historic research process. So dialects and texts have to be referred to very clearly. Now, as a construction of this whole argument on adhartiya, if I talk to you about the whole dialogue on urban water, water bodies, urban water bodies, or water structures in our country. So then our overall perspective is a very built perspective. We talk about kunds, wells, and so on and so forth. But we are never assuming in our architecture, there is never a solution of soft earth as surroundings of water bodies. Now, when you look at it climatically, then to the riparian buffers, and then to the soft earth which is surrounding the rivers is very important. But all that we are doing is riverfront development with hard concrete. The dialogue that I'm trying to take up is that a missing link, adhartiya, which is integrated to a festival process, is sufficient to address so many things which we are not looking at objectively, which we are not trained to identify, and which we are not trained to define either. So as a part of interviews, as a part of focus group discussions, as a part of certain observations from texts and site and context, as a part of documentation analysis and oral histories and life stories, whatever qualitative data you construct, more important than collecting the data is the interrelationship between the data and the objectivity of your research, and what kind of research dialogues that you can take up. So another example that I want to give you in history or historical research is something that we were doing at Mehrauli. So Mehrauli is a urban village in Delhi, which is surrounding Qutub Minar, and we were not able to find the structure. This is way back in 1993, sorry, 94, 95, 96, when we were working on a DDA document that had to be submitted. A master plan, the first of its kind, was submitted to DDA through us and our Department of Conservation of, through Nalini. And we were all trying to identify certain specific areas. So we could identify them only through the way the areas, the hierarchy of the names of areas through which they were called, so the local mint, the local horse stables, the local, guard rooms, the nakar khanas, which are called, and so on and so forth, led to the identification of discovery of structures. Similarly, we were doing certain researches on identifying 99 mosques in Paharganj, which was in a listing of intact way back during our master's program itself. Now, the descriptions of those previous structures which had disappeared because the Maulvi of the mosque had made a house over the mosque itself. These were all small structures, but the descriptions of those structures and the names of gullies and the descriptions of open spaces around them from the previous listings could lead us to the identification of around 40-50 of them. But what I am saying is that information has to be layered out. It has to be taken out, and once it is taken out, the fruit of argument, which we call as research, emerges. Now, this is a diagram which actually I made for the historic research method, wherein I tried to say that your research is not unidirectional. Neither do the observations come from one direction, nor do the set of arguments develop in one direction, and neither does the harvest of research happen in a singular direction. So I have tried to illustrate that, say, for example, I am trying to research on the Jhansi of 1700s, and how did Jhansi develop into a state wherein it was an agriculturally rich state which attracted Britishers. Or maybe I'm trying to do a research on Kumbh down the ages, and how on the riverbed the whole thing is set up every year, and it gets off every year, and it remains in the racial memory of people. So then the case study method is an extremely important part of the historic research method, as much as it is of the architectural research method. You don't research into one culture, or you don't research into one area. You see parallelly of what was happening in other possible areas. So while I'm researching into Jhansi, I also have to look into Bithur. I also have to look into Chitrakoot. I also have to look into other areas of the in the Yamuna and Ganga Doab, not the Indo-Gangetic plain, but the Doab of Ganga and Yamuna, which have a rich alluvial belt, and try to make my studies and inferences through what was happening parallelly. Because the way the world is today, so was it then, except for a few other factors left. We have not transformed too much, or maybe this is a bias, but let it be. But what I'm saying is that the case study method says that you do parallel researches into other systems, into other areas that are leading to this your area. That is one which is very important. In any historic research, the community study method is very important. Now, today, in India, we are all looking at informalities as informalities. But you give me one example of a place which was built in history, or even which is built today, wherein shacks and small shanties do not come up to bring up a big structure. So understanding communities and understanding informalities, then, or maybe how the community structure led to the development of a certain aspect of your historical research, will give the depth in explaining what has held the historical process, or the historical thought, or the historical structure for such a long time. I will give you a couple of examples. Now, the conservation guidelines in our country today is something which is trying to, talk about eradicating all settlements around important building structures. There is a very strong way of looking at the built as the historic structure. But can the built be historic without the settlements around it? Can the Nizamuddin Aulia Dargah or the Ajmer Sharif exist without the people around? The way they had eradicated every settlement around the old fort in Delhi, the Purana Kila, and the way they have not understood the communities that have remained and that have anchored Shahjahanabad. All that I have to say is that in our process of growth, the community and the built stand hand in hand. So understanding the community around the Nizamuddin Aulia Dargah will explain the Nizamuddin Aulia, its existence, together. We have been undertaking this in all our architectural processes and researches all through, and we do it. But highlighting it as an intrinsic part of historic research is important. The minute you see a historic structure which does not relate to community, then that historic structure does not belong. Because at least in India or in the Southeast Asian countries, the whole tradition of living is such that we all live very closely with historicity. Then comes the visual study method. This is a method wherein your architectural skill set and knowledge. Now, people can take up the case study method. Other fields of architecture can, other people from non-architectural fields can take up the community study method. But the visual study method and the transact study method is something that only we can undertake. Okay, so the transact study method is something which I have built in here, and I have built in here because I use it a lot for researches on urban villages and historic settlements. But the visual study method is purely architecture. The transact study method comes from the CNU because they were the one who started first this whole dialogue on transacts and this whole dialogue on picking up small areas and talking about smaller areas. But the visual study method, wherein you look at the building and you start talking about the influences, when you look at the building and you say that the 7 feet lintel or the 6 feet lintel height or the small slot there is actually a gun aim shot point, or maybe this is the parda point, and you start defining, that is your strength. You know, nobody can actually take that strength away from architects and people who are aware of architecture as a way of research. We have not been able to encash on the visual study method and make it into our predominance of research. The way sociology and the way, you know, cultural researchers have created their strongholds into their research methods, we must enforce a lot of, give a lot of emphasis to this research method. I will explain in the next few slides a few of these visual study methods. So from these visual study methods, the data collection, the methodology of data collection and the methodology of argumentation is such that the overall argument, the research, in the intertextuality, as I explained earlier, the two variants in between which the research dialogue is running is something which is the development of the research argument. And the output of the argument could be your desired output of research, which is the flower that is actually going up towards the sun. And then there could be other harvests of research. So the thoughts that emerge from the argument could also lead to subsequent findings, which could be utilized by other researchers. Okay, so this is the structure of historic research. And as far as historic research methods are generally classified as qualitative and quantitative. But when we talk about historic research methods, then we have to look at case studies, community studies, visual studies, and transacts. Now, in terms of quantity, in terms of the historical research methods, we have, I think, only dates and very few numbers which could emerge from records. And also that too, when the history is so strong that it is quoted and it is talked about. Otherwise, in the historical research method, we work with a general awareness and we start talking about the subject through, a certain light, a certain bias, a certain awareness. So now we come on to the topic of bias. But before coming on to the topic of bias, I will discuss this this plan of Varanasi. Now, I will give you a minute to observe this present day master plan of Varanasi before I show you a few more drawings, on Varanasi, and then try and show you that how incorporation of data from contextual studies, how incorporation of data from different racial accounts, how incorporation of data from texts, and data from the minds of people, image maps, can lead to different set of observations. So it will be a matter of observation. In this plan, this is the river Ganga, and then there is these are the areas that are there in the master plan of Varanasi 2001. Now, when we look at the Puranic view of Varanasi, then there is a very specific discussion on how they were viewing it as a trident, how they were viewing it as a chariot, how they were viewing it as a conch shell, and how in the Treta Yuga they are going to talk about it as some combination of a holistic picture that emerges from the place which is Varanasi. Now, these were certain set of plans which were made from Varanasi, and these plans were made approximately in the same geographic boundary. If you look at the plan on the right hand side, and the way the river is flowing, and the way the Varuna river, which is on the top, is occurring, and if you look at this particular image, so then Varuna is flowing somewhere here, right? So Varuna is flowing somewhere here on the top, and we have Ganga at the base, and which is here. So this is Varuna on the top, and Ganga, which is flowing in towards the end, towards the bottom right hand side. So these, can you see my cursor? This is Varuna and this is Ganga. So it is possibly talking about the same geography, but the master plan that we are making as a part of the planning process and the historic maps which are present are a very different level of communication. These are pradikshina maps, the circumambulation of Varanasi, or on what kind of paths do people walk. And these are again a few more maps of the Kashi Kshetra as made by a certain set of Britishers. And this is the James Princip map, and another Kashi Darpan map where the flow of the river Ganga and the river Varuna on the top is actually taken as a bow and the bowstring, So all that I'm trying to say is that historical research, when accumulated from all other collaborative, thinking in a certain area, is something that can lead to a very concrete argument. And it can give you a solid argument as to how to look at your master plan. Why is it so non-happening, non-communicative? And why is it that there are just two-dimensional values in this master plan, whereas there is so much of depth of belonging and so much of depth of people owing up to and knowing these areas in a greater detail. Even the James Princip map is showing things more clearly around the river. So coming back from here to the subject of bias. Now, bias is actually awareness. Research is awareness, investigation, documentation, and effort to relook at the process without a bias. Okay, but in historic researches, you have to have certain biases which you keep. I will explain what kind of biases we must always keep in researches which emanate from architecture. And these kind of biases have to be kept in mind, not just for our PhDs, but also while we are doing researches at the level of thesis, of master's programs, and even bachelor programs. Because what is generally seen is that research being research, people lose grip on the research because they don't have those frames. I'm not saying that bias is a frame, but certain set of framings have to be there, and some biases have to be kept so that we follow them. So bias is the standpoint from which the situation is viewed. Changes in bias will eradicate the strength of one and give parallel viewpoints. So changes in bias are important, but losing your bias in research can actually derail the complete historical research methodology. So certain assumptions and certain biases Like in a reconnaissance survey, you construct a certain argument. Similarly, a bias has to be constructed very carefully to probe through the historic research. And at the end of the day, at the end of the research, the bias could be destroyed, but by other findings. But you must have a guiding tool in hand before you proceed. Now, bias in design. Recency bias. This is a bias. This is a type of bias which happens when we see a lot of things together, but are not able to memorize or remember only the latest of the objects or places. So primacy bias and so on and so forth. Let's leave this. Let's go to a bias that now this was another imageability map from Kashi, which talks so explicitly about Kashi and which can give, so much more depth. I am taking you to the last slide on biases which have to be intrinsic to a design dissertation, to a design dissertation, to a design thesis, to an architectural thesis. As architects, we must keep the bias of being an architect very close to our hearts and try and endeavor in the benefit of our profession to see that we look at things very specifically. So I've tried to list down a certain set of biases that we are taught at the undergrad level, and even some people can carry it on to their postgrad programs, but most of the programs work in such a way that you lose the bias of being an architect. So I mean, it is that building is to be designed. The design centricity of an architectural research through built morphology, through buildings, is something that has to be kept close to heart. That building is to be thought as a system. A building is not independent. So the minute we start thinking of building as a system, contributing not just to a cultural or a social or a service system, but as an economic system also, then we are encouraging our research through the building in different directions. But building has to come up on a piece of land. That is the land and the build economics, which is of importance to all of us as architects, and otherwise also in the planning dialogue and in the dialogue of urban informalities, which I say. I mean, there is an argument that I had put up with the G20 countries when I was presenting my policy in 2022. I said that if you look at urban informalities as infrastructure, rather than calling them as derelict and as slums, then you save so much of capital, because at the end of the day, the infrastructure, if all urban informalities become contributors to the construction of cities, if they are contributing to the well-being of cities, then they definitely are infrastructure. But because we are not letting the connection of the informal transactions of land to the formalized transactional formats which are approved by the government, and we are calling it illegal, that is why we are losing on a lot of capital that can be contributed by the build. So that is where this whole bias of looking at a system as, or maybe an economic or a planning system from the perspective of architect could actually guide us to that dialogue. Now, buildings make a city. I mean, very true. Spaces also make a city, and spaces are formulated by buildings in a city or whatever it is. I mean, so it's a dialogue on placemaking. Design helps conceive buildings. So therein, design and the research dialogue remains active. Problems and needs can be predicted through form, through urban form, through built form. Each design belongs to a style. Style can be studied. So these are all certain set of biases wherein the built or the architect in us can be retained. Now, after this, I am coming, because I have almost taken an hour of your time. So after this, I am coming to layering, which is very important in the process of doing historical researches, especially when they are settlement-based researches. So we try to create and we try to layer off every part of the, a settlement, like we try to layer off every aspect, the social layer, the cultural layer, the layer of economics, the layer of trade, the layer of administration. So by way of arguments in other fields, so in architecture, we do layering. So we try and look at layers along with cultural areas, we look at layers along with watersheds, we look at layer along with so much more information that it leads to analysis on, and especially when we look at it with reference to house forms, we realize that layering leads to a better understanding of a settlement. Like this was a study on a village urban village in Noida, which we were doing. So we were doing this layering. So we could understand the evolution of a certain set of settlements, because the basis of these sketches, which are on the right hand side, which are the build sketches, is not just the data which is there on the ground, but a lot of other parallel things, like they sold their lands to the government and the government gave them compensation, so they got rich at a particular point, and that was around 2010 when the explosion of buildings happened. And the kacha houses, which you can see in 2002, at the time when Noida was getting formed, and when most of these villages were notified to be taken up by Noida, but not yet built. So, that whole process had started, and but it had not actually gained impetus. So by 2010, when they started getting their compensations, they started building high. And by 2018, when by the master plan of Noida, that area had so much of development around it that we could see it catering to the shortage in housing needs. We could see it coming up with the red dots, which are the commercials, which are not shown in the layer, but in the block sketches. So layering is also not just a 2D exercise. Layering has to be done by identifying buildings. We look at building typologies. We look at the way the building is being used. We have unstructured interviews, and then we come up with this kind of an exercise. So layering should not be forgotten. And then this is the last thing, the community research methods, the PRA tools, which are the rural appraisal tools, which are also used for the community researches, wherein we have to, most of these PRA tools are ethnographic, wherein, or maybe they are methods wherein you work with people's first-hand accounts, so you are not just looking at a place from a distance, but you are participating in it. So you are working with lived experiences. It becomes phenomenological, So most of these tools require an in-depth awareness of the community, and even if it be the community which has substituted the layer of the community to for which you are searching the history of, or for which you are trying to have a historical research. So say, for example, you are looking at the British perspective towards Indian settlement on which they made their peace. I will give you an example. In the pre-British, pre-Mughal layer of Delhi, there were 5 important monuments which are written down in our texts. One is the Hanuman Mandir, which is in CP, and then the rest 4 are lying in other areas. One is the Mahamaya temple, then is Mandir in Kailash colony, then is Neeli Chhatri Mahadev, which is right now in Old Delhi, and the one is the Bhairav Mandir, which is next to the Purana Kila. But the Hanuman Mandir was in the heart of a village which Latvians eradicated, but he could not resist the locals, and he committed that he would let that place be. Like Malcha Mahal, Malcha, and that whole settlement was Malcha. So all of this village of Malcha still has a case against Latvians, which is there in the court today, and that case is still running in the Indian courts, and no decision has been taken. The villagers then had put up a case on Malcha. The villagers of Malcha had put up a case for the village being destroyed, but the Hanuman Mandir could not be destroyed. So that was a part of the the village Malcha. And so you can, if say, for example, I'm doing a research into the eradication of that village, first of all, finding accounts will be very difficult. But then even if I go into it, my process will not be complete till the time I take up ethnographic awareness or ethnographic tools, or have a phenomenological approach towards understanding the first-hand accounts and people, and what kind of communities would have been there, who built up the cases, and what was happening and whatnots. So at the end of this, the transact study method, I will take it up very briefly. This comes from the CNU, the Charter of New Urbanization. The Charter of New Urbanization initiated this method, which was actually a geological research method, But when you observe small parts of your historical research has to be taken up into small segments, which when integrated give you the view of a composite whole. This is the transacts, the historic transacts that you take up are very similar to planning transacts which are taken up, and they are very similar to the geological transacts through which this whole method was recognized by CNU. But and they have to be supported by the case studies of parallel other areas in that time within that geography. So this was a transact study method, and this is a small chart which I wanted to share with you. I will send it to you all on your, through a common chat, or I will share it with Indra. And this is a very interesting chart. We are very short of time. I have overshot by, I think, 10 minutes. But the whole process of architectural research methods can be looked at through orientations and assumptions. And the chart tries to explain that the ontological, the epistemological, ontological is that metaphysical constants. The epistemological is the theory, comes from the theory of knowledge. And through research goals and methodological orientations, the different how different types of researches are undertaken. In fact, I tried to go through all of it in my class studios in the master's program, but it takes a lot of time here. So this is where I would like to end my presentation. And all that I would like to say at the end of it is that the bias of being an architect has to be kept alive in all our researches. And that's about it. So thank you. And I hope.
Yes, sir. You are pretty much on schedule and time.
Yeah, thank you. I was told by Indra that you have to speak for an hour. I said, okay. So,
yes, sir.
Yeah.
It was a very insightful presentation. I would give a formal thanks. And participants, this you can put across your questions in the chat box. Thank you, Professor Anand KHATRI, sir, for such an engaging presentation. Your presentation was clear, crisp, and was very systematic, especially the outlook into the historic architectural research. It helped us to inspire and become more sensitive and aware in our academic writings towards collaborative thought, towards holistic master plans of the cities, layered social structures, etc. And through community research methods, PRA tools, how to gain a better understanding of the present and past state of affairs in the historic contents, and how to take control and have a holistic development towards your research writing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Afreen. Any questions coming up from you would help me gain more clarity on my process. Otherwise, it's fine.
Hi, sir. I'm Shravanti here.
Yes,
With your last slide, you said architect and then you said bias. So I was looking for it. Is bias a word that you're using, the terminology, or the normal English word, which is bias?
See, generally the word bias in research is something that is talked about as something that has to be avoided for research clarity, but in the evolving dialogue on architectural profession engaging with PhD or engaging with research at different levels in masters and in conservation and in even in our BArch theses. So we generally lose a grip on the whole program of architecture, and we go and start dwelling into some other area which may not be our area, our domain of knowledge. So the last slide was just a indication that we must retain our domain of knowledge and try to bring up the argument through our domain of knowledge. We must retain that bias. This is not a accepted method of working, but I'm just saying that as architects, we must retain the bias of being architects and try to see that the design is inculcated in the methodology so that our researches have that uniqueness of being carried out by the knowledge of built.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope it answers the question, Shruti. Yeah. Any other questions, audience? There is a question in the chat box by architect Naveen Kumar.
Okay.
So he's asking, please, sir, suggest a book in which we can cover historical research methods.
There is none, because there are a lot of books on research tools. There are lots of books on design as research. There is Linda Groth. I mean, we know of all these books, but historical research methods and architectural history as research methods for exploring architectural history or settlement history is still not talked about. That is because, if you look at the evolution of research, which comes from medicine, taken up by sociology and by languages, it comes to architecture very recently only, when people have been researching in other areas through qualitative and quantitative data. Of what they call as qualitative and quantitative, but we are still evolving. So the whole idea is that our research method should be developed by us. All of us, when we retain that bias, can we find our own bearings with architecture and with research.
Okay, sir. There's another question. I hope it answers the question, Mr. Naveen. There's another question by architect Nikhil Baswadkar. He's asking, what are the scope of historical research in urban design stream or in study of cities?
See, historical research in cities is very important. Like I'll tell you, if you are talking at the level of a city, I may not be able to answer your question. But if I talk about a village, I can definitely answer your question. I recently did a 25 years GPSDP on a village, a rural setting. So then, while calculating, the village had 5 ponds, right? So the whole argument of historical research, I'm giving you the example through only one frame, that is urban water. When we saw 5 ponds which were gradually being encroached and built on, so apart from losing that opportunity to harvest rainwater, there was not much. But then when we did cross sections of that area, and when we started looking at things more carefully, then we realized that the whole area of that village, which was the catchment area, multiplied by the coefficient of runoff or evaporation, when put together, was equal to the volume of the 5 ponds, right? So overlooking it by way of oversight is one way, incorporating it in our processes is another. So this is one way wherein I personally feel that somewhere in the scheme that we did by way of urban planning, by way of design-based planning through CNU systems, by way of urban design, or whatever you call it, I don't divide architecture into streams of thinking or limitations of thought at the master's level, but the historical research was leading to a very definitive aim. So that is what I said, that research methods for historical research is something else, and historical research cannot actually be avoided. That is the first argument I took up in the discussion. So it is extremely important to look back where we are coming from, especially in our fields. Thank you, M. Srinidhi, and thank you, Indra. Thank you all. I mean, I did not try to construct most of my argument on, qualitative and quantitative, because I realized that you would be bored to death thinking research as qualitative or quantitative. And it's not always very important to define, because the research method comes up from the intertextual dialogue, comes up from the variables, and don't get guided by books. Research is something which is done by passion. Pick up topics or pick up areas which really hit you in the heart, and through which you can connect for a very long period of time, which can be you yourself. And believe me, you will discover more and more ways and more methods. So that is all that I would like to say to you all.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
I wanted to put insight into the part where you spoke about the raporitic rivers and how there was a word called adharti. Adhartiya towards the river basins, and how we overlook it in urban design or master plans.
Right. So, should I say a little more on that?
Yes, sir. Because my topic towards rainwater harvesting systems in the southern part of India is what I'm developing into. My writing is in those lines. Yes.
Okay. So, when I was writing a paper on how the people who have migrated from Bihar or from northern Bihar have their festivals have changed, and some have disappeared because most of them had a geographical connect, So and then I was, and being aware of literature, as my introduction told you, that I write poetry, I'm a poet, and so on and so forth. So I have a lot of friends who were writing specifically on this stuff. So there are certain professors who were trying to keep that interest in poetry alive by keeping those words alive. So they were trying to use those words from the lingual or the dialectical, references to that festival alive. So Adhartiya is that soft earth in which you stand to pay respect to the rising sun. Now, to be in the Adhartiya in Delhi, people stand in buckets of water and pay respect to the rising sun. So we don't have urban water, but there are a lot of migrants who move to the soft beds of the river, and we keep on reading about a lot of casualties that keep on happening in these big cities when the soft earth around the river is being used. So even if I say that I am overstretching the word Adhartiya to signify what is required to pay respect to the sun during Chhat, and even if I lead the argument into understanding how water systems and how riverfronts and how rivers have to live next to us, then Adhartiya is the reperine buffer. It is the buffer which is important. If you look at very carefully on the riverfront developments that have been done in Lucknow and Ahmedabad, with all good intention, I'm not saying that any intention of what we are doing is bad. Urbanization is the biggest boon in our lives, and we are surviving because of urbanization. But when you look at the way it has happened, and the complete neglect of that soft reperine buffer, then we read that news that lakhs and lakhs of fishes were dead one fine day in these rivers, and they were found floating on the river, during summers, because all the air inside water, or all the oxygen had evaporated, and there were no plants in the riparian buffer to recharge it. Now, even if you look at the volume of birds who are found next to the rivers, they come to eat insects only in the riparian buffer. So when you talk about river systems, you are not talking about water, you are talking about systems. And when you are talking about systems, and when you look at the way people engaged it by the way of languages, then just one word is enough if you try and interconnect it across to explain the importance of the riverfront and the soft soil of rivers. So that was the point that I was trying to draw through the use of dialects and texts, you know.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
So I had one question. It's a very direct question. It's nothing to do with a particular topic. And it's largely on a research base. Like when you're doing a research, is it correct to put in a statement saying that the research the research result will facilitate XYZ? Like, is that a correct statement to say when you're starting the result, like the research? Like, so you start studying, but you are probably working on so that you come to a particular result and which will facilitate a particular domain or a particular practice. So is it correct to use this kind of language or thing like that? I mean,
yeah. See, Aarti Daga, all that I want to say is that if you put it as a hypothesis, then you prove it this way or that way. But you definitely have to have a bias, So you definitely have to have a objective towards picking up a research thought or picking up a topic for research. And that in itself is sufficient to drive you towards the research. And that is what you're saying, that your research would facilitate, although it is not correct. You cannot say that the research will facilitate, but none of the architects and planners or none of us who are present here from the field of either architecture or planning and who are doing their researches or are interested in research, we all carry a certain underlying subtext. And it is this subtext that we have to discover for ourselves. I find research more as a self-purifying fire, because as I said that, you have to be those young men and women again, who are rebelling against the biases that were fed into you and which you rebelled during your youth, So you have to be that rebellious thinker which tries to throw out everything out of your system and start thinking from the fresh plate. But definitely a sense of direction is required, which you call as a hypothesis in research, and which I could also call as a research frame, which could lead you to a certain point, and then you collapse it yourself, or it gets collapsed by findings. But a certain thread is required. But but nonetheless, trying to begin research by saying that it will lead to a solution may limit your area of research towards solution finding. Say for example, you say that your research will lead to design, and then you start saying qualitative methods, quantitative methods. So design research methodology is very different, So then these qualitative and quantitative don't contribute towards it. So what I'm saying is that in that whole process, your methodology should orient towards your research thought, because your research thought, first of all, if you are hitting at a certain solution, is not free. Secondly, so you will not enjoy that research a lot. But even if you limit your freedom by writing a hypothesis that it is assumed that it is going to lead to solve such and such a problem, then too, your journey is not going to be a very free journey. So the more you remain clear about your research, the more free it is, and the more you freely conclude it towards your dialogue. That is what is research design, and that is what is the selection of the intertextuality and the dialogue that has to be there in the main argument of research.
right. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for such a lovely array of questions, and I would give a formal vote of thanks, sir. We have great pleasure in offering a vote of thanks at the end of the second session for this third day. We are privileged to have you, sir. Thank you, Professor ANAND, KHATRI, sir, for taking time and sharing your valuable insight from your immense experience. Thank you so much. We deem it a privilege to offer our great thanks to COA Director Dr. Navneet Munut, sir, our Director Ma'am Architect KHATRI, our Vice Principal Architect Indira Kohli Ma'am, for the constant support and guidance. Thanks to one and all, the online coordinators and the participants for making the session successful. Kindly please switch on your camera for the screenshots for session 2 of day 3. Audience, please switch on your cameras for a screenshot. Yes, we are done. Thank you so much. Please switch off your cameras. Thanks again and have a great evening.
See you all tomorrow again. That is on day 4. We have Dr. Ashwini Kumar talking in the first session. He's talking on academic research writing and publication process. And the session 2 is Dr. Anchal Sharma. Her topic would be architectural research data analysis in simulation method and techniques. So hope, and I'm sure we're all gaining a lot of information. Yeah, and we need to continue to see the end of the faculty development program. Yeah, thank you so much. We can log out.